Hey guys, welcome back to another video. This is a quick little thing I pulled over from the Mini Docs channel to show off here. I thought maybe you guys on this channel would also enjoy this kind of content. So if you like what you see, don't forget to check out the Mini Docs channel. I'll have links to that in the video description and the pinned comments below. Okay guys, let's go ahead and get started. Iraq had established a nuclear program sometime in the 1960s, and in the mid-1970s looked to expand it through the acquisition of a nuclear reactor. After failing to convince the French government to sell them a plutonium-producing reactor and reprocessing plant, and likewise failing to convince the Italian government to sell them a Cyrene-style reactor, the Iraqi government convinced the French government to sell them an OSIRIS-class research reactor. The purchase also included a smaller accompanying ISIS-type reactor, the sale of 72 grams of 93% enriched uranium, and the training of personnel. The total cost has been given as $300 million. In November of 1975, the countries signed a nuclear cooperation agreement, and in 1976, the sale of the reactor was finalized. Iraq received from France a shipment of approximately 12.5 kilograms of highly enriched uranium fuel to be used in the reactor. The shipment was the first of a planned 6 deliveries totaling 72 kilograms of enriched uranium. Iraq and France claimed that the Iraqi reactor was intended for peaceful scientific research. Agreements between France and Iraq excluded military use. For years prior to the revolution in Iran, Iran and Israel, who were unofficial allies at this time, had monitored Iraq's OSIRIS nuclear reactor. After the Iranian Revolution, Iran's new government heightened their surveillance of the reactor, and at times, certain elements of the Iranian and Israeli intelligence continued to assist each other clandestinely because they had a common enemy, Iraq. Although claims had been made by both Iraq and France that the Iraqi nuclear reactor had no military use, Iran and Israel were unwilling to take that risk. They saw Iraq as a hostile military force with expansionist ambitions. As a result, both Iran and Israel kept a very close eye on the Iraqi nuclear reactor, and both had drawn up contingency plans to knock it out if the order was to come from the top. When the Iran-Iraq war broke out, Iran became increasingly concerned that Iraq would develop nuclear weapons to use against them. It is thought that Iran was supplied intel about the reactor facility by Israeli and Syrian intelligence, who both reported that the work on the reactors was advancing. This was obviously a cause of alarm for Iran and for Israel. Iran quickly turned back to their contingency plan to attack the plant. But there was one major problem that the contingency plan had not taken into account. The Iranians no longer had the benefit of a surprise attack. Iraq and Iran were at war, and the Iraqis had air defenses set up to protect that reactor. Needless to say, Iran decided an attack must be executed, but they needed a new plan. Operation Scorch Sword was the first such attack on a nuclear reactor and the third on any nuclear facility in history. It was also the first instance of a preventative attack on a reactor, the intent of which was to forestall the development of any nuclear weapon that Iraq could potentially threaten Iran with in the future. The Iranian Air Force began to plan out an entirely new plan to attack OSIRIS. The Iranians had little intelligence about the plant, and there was even a risk that it was already being fueled, increasing the possibility of radioactive fallout. So Iran decided, with suspected Israeli input, that they would not target the actual reactor itself in fear of a nuclear fallout over Baghdad or even the risk of a greater area being affected, but instead would target the research laboratories, reactor control buildings, and the training facilities. The intention being to knock out the facility for the time being until the two countries, both Iran and Israel, could find a way around the nuclear fallout issue and to deal with the reactor once and for all. Operation Scorch Sword was an airstrike carried out by the Iranian Air Force. The operation took place 8 days into the Iran-Iraq War at dawn on the 30th of September 1980. This attack damaged an almost complete nuclear reactor located 17 kilometers southeast of Baghdad, Iraq. The OSIRIS nuclear reactor was defended by a single SA-6 missile battery, 3 Roland-2 missile batteries mounted in a triangle some 500 meters around the reactor, and 40 anti-aircraft aircraft artillery positions, 23mm and 57mm radar guided guns. The Iranians had to fly low over the target and move at high speeds and get out quickly. Due to this, the mission was to be carried out by Iran's most skilled pilots, a high price to pay for Iran if they were shot down and captured or killed. As the flight of 2 Iranian F-4 Phantoms approached the reactor control building, they remained at a very low altitude, pulling up again at the last moment, barely at 2 miles from the target. To the surprise of the pilots, the Iraqis did not fire even a single missile or shell at them. Approaching on a direct route and executing a perfect attack, the Iranians swiftly sighted their targets east of the reactor buildings, rolled out and released 12 Mark 82 bombs, remaining in the air over the target for only 6 seconds. Simultaneously, the 2 Phantoms hit their targets, taking out the power supply to Baghdad for the next 2 days. Amazingly, witnesses reported that at least 2 Iranian Mark 82 bombs clearly impacted the reactor itself, while the other bombs triggered a massive blaze that damaged all other installations in the complex, such as the cooling pumps, the labs, and the other support facilities. The strike was successful in disrupting the Iraqi nuclear program, both physically and psychologically. As the Iraqis immediately denounced Iran for its cooperation with Israel, both Iraq and France would go on to accuse Israel of being the one who carried out the attack. Some believe this was a desperate attempt to avoid humiliation at the hands of the Iranians, a country Iraq was currently at war with. Israel emphatically denied all such allegations and confirmed Iran was indeed responsible for the attack. What some are calling a show of force by Iran, and to confirm it was indeed Iran who hit the Iraqi reactor, a lone Iranian F-4 Phantom took off from Hamadan in a recon mission over the reactor facility in order to gather a battle damage assessment. Flying at low level, the Phantom made a single pass over Osirak, taking the desired pictures. Despite being fired at by several Iraqi AAA positions and SAM sites, the Phantom avoided them and returned safely into Iran. Once the pictures were analyzed, they confirmed that the attack was successful. The Iraqi nuclear reactor had been dealt with, for now. After Iran's Operation Scorch Sword had successfully hit the target buildings and even hit a reactor, knocking the reactor out for about 8 to 9 months, the damage had been quickly repaired by French technicians. Both Iran and Israel expected the repairs to take longer than they did, and both were not pleased with the speed at which the facility was back up and running. Israel now put into action Operation Oprah, also known as Operation Babylon, a surprise airstrike conducted by the Israeli Air Force on the 7th of June 1981 to finally destroy the unfinished Iraqi nuclear reactor southeast of Baghdad. The basic procedure for the airstrike had been formulated as early as 1979. However, the Israelis needed photographic intelligence about the layout of the plant. That task allegedly fell to the Iranians. Iran is thought to have shared the reconnaissance photos taken by the F-4 Phantom reconnaissance jet, which took pictures of the Osirak reactor after the attack. The photographs were allegedly placed in a top-secret metal container, and certain elements of Iranian intelligence delivered them to the Israelis. With these photographs, the Israelis began to finalize their plans for Operation Oprah. The Iraqi Air Force was a potential threat to the Israelis. Israel had an advantage in that Iraq was preoccupied fighting Iran. On the 4th of April 1981, the Iranian Air Force launched a major attack on Iraq's H-3 air base in the western part of the country. 8 Iranian F-4 Phantoms carried out long-range bombing missions that struck the airbase. During this attack, 48 Iraqi aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Among the aircraft hit were 2 Tupolev 22 blinders and 3 Tupolev 16 Badger strategic bombers, which could have been used to retaliate against Israel in the event of an attack. The attack was a severe blow to Iraqi air power and largely gave Iran air superiority over Iraq. Israeli reconnaissance planes had been monitoring Iraq during the attack and observed that the Iraqi Air Force had been severely degraded and their retaliatory capacity had been weakened. This bolstered the Israelis as they continued to prepare for the attack. Some sources say that senior Israeli officials met with Iranian officials in France 1 month prior to the Israeli attack. The source of these assertions is Ari Ben Menashe, a former Israeli government employee. At the alleged meeting, the Iranians explained details of their 1980 attack on the site, and even agreed to let Israeli planes land at an Iranian airfield in Tabriz in the case of an emergency. While the new Iranian government was officially hostile to Israel due to both nations having a common enemy, Iraq, the Iranians feared that the Iraqis would create an atomic bomb to use against them. They clandestinely worked with Israel to forestall such a development. The Israelis utilized a squadron of heavily fueled and heavily armed F-16As with a group of F-15As to provide air cover and fighter support. This package could perform a surgical strike to eliminate the reactor site without having to refuel. The operation was launched on a Sunday afternoon under the assumption that workers present on the site, including foreign experts employed at the reactor, would have left. Notwithstanding this precaution, there were hundreds of French workers and other nationals at the plant at the time of the attack. The operation started on the 7th of June 1981 at 1600 local time. The Israeli planes left Etzion Air Base flying unchallenged in Jordanian and Saudi airspace. To avoid detection, the Israeli pilots conversed in Saudi-accented Arabic while in Jordanian airspace, and told the Jordanian air controllers that they were a Saudi patrol that had gone off course. While flying over Saudi Arabia, they pretended to be Jordanians, using Jordanian radio signals and formations. The Israeli planes were so heavily mounted that the external fuel tanks that had been mounted on the planes were exhausted in flight. The tanks were jettisoned over the Saudi desert. Upon reaching Iraqi airspace, the squadron split up, with 2 of the F-15s forming close escort to the F-16 squadron and the remaining F-15s dispersing into Iraqi airspace as a diversion and ready backup. The attack squadron descended to 30 meters or 100 feet over the Iraqi desert, attempting to fly under the radar of the Iraqi defenses. At 1835 local time, 20 kilometers from the Osirak reactor complex, the F-16 formations climbed to 6,900 feet and went into a 35-degree dive aimed at the reactor complex. The F-16s began releasing their Mark 84 bombs in pairs. At least 8 of the 16 released bombs struck the containment dome of the reactor. It was later revealed that half an hour before the Israeli planes arrived, a group of Iraqi soldiers manning the anti-aircraft defenses had left their posts for an afternoon meal, turning off their radars. The Israeli planes were still intercepted by Iraqi defenses, but managed to evade the remaining anti-aircraft fire. The squadron climbed to high altitude and started their return to Israel. The attack lasted less than 2 minutes. Iraq said that they would rebuild the facility, and France agreed, in principle, to aid in the reconstruction. Because of a mix of factors, including the Iran-Iraq War, international pressure, and Iraqi payment problems, negotiations broke down in 1984, and France withdrew from the project. The Osirak facility remained in its damaged state until the 1991 Persian Gulf War, when it was completely destroyed by subsequent coalition airstrikes by the United States Air Force. One of the Israeli pilots who participated in the attack was Ilan Roman, who was the youngest pilot to participate in the operation. He would later become the first Israeli astronaut and would be killed in the Columbia space shuttle disaster. The destruction of the Iraqi nuclear reactor marks some of the most daring and successful airstrikes in modern history for both Iran and Israel, and is marked with cooperation of 2 unlikely allies. Both Operation Scorched Sword and Operation Oprah showed the willingness and capability of both the Iranian and Israeli air forces to eliminate any threat posed by Iraq against their respective nations.